then suddenly somebody opens the door or somebody breaks in, or you're able to have a peek, and it's just kind of like, yeah, this wild ecosystem, in the middle of this really dense built area. And it's kind of like it has that kind of element of surprise, and it's almost like just magical, like all of these things for decades were happening around, and quietly and silently this fantastic fourth new nature was kind of growing over there.
I'm broadcasting from Tacoma, Washington, aka Grit City, in the native land of the Puyallup tribe and Stilca people. This is Tree Hugger Podcast, the show where we reimagine ecological restoration, and the episode where we discuss finding justice in nearby nature, as well as the characteristics and magic in novel species configurations. Those ecosystems that have resulted from anthropogenic interventions, but do not necessarily rely on human maintenance. So I think we have peripherally discussed novel ecosystems on the podcast, but we haven't dug deep into them yet. A few months ago, Mel PIneda-Pinto popped up on my radar. She seemed like the right person to invite for a conversation because she explores the integration of nature-based solutions in ecological justice. Mel is currently working as a postdoctoral research fellow at Trinity College Dublin on the project NovelEco, in which they are co-designing an online citizen science tool to better understand novel ecosystems in cities. She and co-authors recently wrote a wonderful treatise published in Urban Forestry and Urban Greening called Finding Justice in Wild Novel Ecosystems, a review through a multi-species lens. This is what I read and fell in love with. Before this, she completed a Master's of Environment from the University from Melbourne. This work is informed by previous architectural and planning experience in the industry and not-for-profit sectors. Her academic experience and interests cut across social research methods, interdisciplinary collaboration, and systems thinking in the context of urban ecosystems, justice, and ethics. Living in my little bubble, I thought restoration ecologist Richard Hobbs had conceived of the term novel ecosystems to describe shifting ecologies and the anthropogenic ecosystems that have no historical analog. They're often defined as something that cannot be restored to anything looking or feeling like their historical precedents. Flash forward to now, the literature review that Mel and her co-authors conducted goes way beyond what I had ever imagined. More folks than restorationists are considering and describing novel assemblages of the human-induced and other than human agency that creates what are also known as non-analog communities, ruderal ecologies and landscapes, and emerging ecosystems. Geographers and anthropologists are using terms like wild spaces, urban wilderness, informal green spaces, urban wildscape, and urban wastelands. And then in the social sciences, one will see these spaces referred to as interstitial spaces, wastegapes, unintentional landscapes, which is one of my new favorite terms, superfluous landscapes, terrain vague, and ambivalent landscapes. So taking a step back, as we gain traction on global restoration efforts, there has been, and maybe there still is, a debate within ecological restoration about how to restore ecosystems that some people think have crossed thresholds and now express new assemblages of species with no historical equivalent. So Hobbs et al. Back in 2006, referred to these ecosystems as the new ecological world order that have both value and provide ecosystem services. These systems often don't respond to traditional restoration approaches, and it can be costly or impossible to restore them to what they were before, quote-unquote, complete transformation due to land use change, extinction, or climate disruption, etc. A Trojan horse is often used as a metaphor to signify a trick that causes someone to invite a foe or threat into a securely protected place. It may be the height of the debate. An ecologist by the name of Simberloff titled a pop science essay in the spirit of this metaphor to describe the novel ecosystem's potential impact as a, quote-unquote, license to trash nature that also threatens the practice of restoration from within, back in 2015. A very hot exchange of views played out in the ecology journal surrounding this issue, including but not limited to the retention of unrealistic restoration goals and types of intervention, successful restoration occurring in ecosystems considered novel, merits of non-native species and the utility of the term degraded, and qualitative versus quantitative approaches to novel ecosystems and potential trajectories of change. Hybrid ecosystems have also been described as those occupying a middle ground that retain characteristics of the historic ecosystem, but whose composition and function now lies, very well used term, outside the historic range of variability. These types of ecosystems may often be wrapped up with the current cultural values and practices where human stewardship buffers the ecosystem's capacity to respond to disturbance. Also, people's tending and management may lead to local extinctions alongside gains of new species and new combinations or assemblages, resulting in new interactions and ecosystem dynamics. For example, the use of non-native or invasive species may facilitate direct or indirect interactions such as pollination and competitive release. The emergence of novel ecosystems has beckoned a call for a new science of transition. The institution most properly placed to facilitate communication about standards is probably the Society for Ecological Restoration. This membership group developed and consolidated the first international primer on ecological restoration in 2004. The primer provided 9 attributes in which to measure restoration success. One key element is nudging an ecosystem towards a reference condition, sometimes historically based, that continues to sustain itself in spite of stress, often conceptualized around historical ecological pathways. Way back in early 2020, the Tree Hugger episode 7 on Society for Ecological Restoration, I asked Bethany Walder, how does SER tackle the restoration of ecosystems challenged by irreversible environmental change, such as climates with no analog? So I don't want to put words in Bethany's mouth, but you can track back to that response in about minute 49 of episode 7, the Tree Hugger episode, Society for Ecological Restoration with Bethany Walder. So to this day, SER does not recognize novel ecosystems in any of its publications. But going back to the early 2010s, restoration ecologists have carried out comprehensive assessments of the SER primer from the early 2000s, as well as the newer standards and principles of ecological restoration, encouraging SER to go above and beyond species composition according to historical fidelity, to focus on function, ecosystem services, and human well-being goals while also emphasizing resilience in the face of human-induced hazards and disturbances. The major distinction between the restoration described by SER and novel ecosystem advocates includes, but is not limited to, 1. Belief in an ecological threshold signifying a point of no return that deviates from natural variability, and 2. Acceptance of using non-native species and assisting the natural processes to build ecosystem function. Perhaps with some caution, the updated SER standards prioritizes the more desirable restoration, relegating other projects to a form of rehabilitation that don't have intention to recover an ecosystem to a quote-unquote appropriate local native reference ecosystem. This sidestepping of novel ecosystems presents a challenge to those wishing to plan, monitor, and evaluate novel ecosystem work. However, the standards do provide some guidance about the use of reference ecosystems in the face of irreversible environmental change. SER recommends adopting references assembled from diverse sources of information while using adaptive management to adapt recovery tactics in the likely event of environmental change. The likely event. Facing uncertainty with climate disruption, I really see a benefit to adopting what Aplett and McKinney in 2016 characterized as a portfolio approach, managing the exposure and vulnerability of ecosystems by pursuing conservation strategies that require differing levels of intervention. When considering whether we default to using novel ecosystems or we continue to restore to historical references, I refer back to 2019 when I saw Eric Higgs' lecture in Seattle about this thorny question. The question essentially is, how do we act responsibly in ecosystems lacking historical continuity? The takeaway from the Higgs lecture was about hubris. So who defines ecological restoration and who does the practice belong to? In order to meet our local needs and those global restoration ambitions that we have mentioned in previous episodes of Tree Hugger Podcast, We will need to accept a diversity of opinions that will shape a compelling vision of restoration. We will not meet our goals if the philosophy and practice of restoration doesn't resonate with people. So I've been thinking about this topic for a while now. You probably heard threads of it in previous episodes. You will probably continue to hear about it. But I don't want it to detract now from this conversation with Mel PIneda-Pinto. It starts right here. Enjoy the conversation.
So my name is Melissa Pineda-Pinto, but please everybody call me Mel, just easier. I am originally from Costa Rica, a very small country in Central America. That's where I did my undergrads in architecture, where I gained most of my industry and not-for-profit sector experience. After that, I went off to do a Master's of Environment at the University of Melbourne, in which I did a small research project around environmental ethics and urban planning. And after that, I continued to do at Swinburne University of Technology a PhD that looked at the integration of nature-based solutions and ecological justice. And I am currently at Trinity College Dublin in Dublin, Ireland, with an amazing group of people at a project called NovelEco, in which we are exploring the ecology, but also the social perceptions and attitudes towards novel ecosystems in cities. I can see that you have a four-legged one behind you.
Yeah, that's Hazel.
Hey, Hazel.
She would rather be outside, but if I leave her out there too long, she'll start digging the yard. So yeah, she'll just hang out right there.
I have two as well, so we might get a few barks, but if you can edit, then that's wonderful.
Yeah, definitely. Every once in a while they show up. Yeah, I read you were a dog person. Do you know that term?
I am, yes, animal person in general, but I've been with dogs all my life.
I read that you were a volunteer at a dog shelter, or that you created a dog shelter.
Well, I have volunteered in many dog shelters, but also back home in Costa Rica, there's still not a lot of good management with issues around animal welfare. So where I lived, we just started like a small group, very kind of informal, but we would organize small events to try to raise little funds and things that could help us, bring a dog in and try to find a home for them.
Do you think that still sticks with you? Do you think that influences your work and your perspective on things?
Yes, absolutely. It has a lot about how we value and what we value and how we care for others, humans and non-humans. And I suppose that just first I grew up with dogs and animals all my life. So I suppose that was that nurture and caring for was inside of me all the time. Maybe also seeing just the reality in the streets, dogs abandoned all the time, dogs and cats tied up to gates, just kind of suppose develops that in you to want to care and protect and help. After my teens, I actually wanted to be a marine biologist and I wanted to work in conservation and in the oceans. Coming from Costa Rica, we have the Caribbean Sea or the Atlantic Ocean, and then we have the Pacific Ocean. So we have these really long coasts. And so I was always very influenced since small by the coast and the oceans and this interface between water and land. And seeing figures like Jacques Cousteau, I was always fascinated, and I wanted to be like, a version of Jacques Cousteau.
Can I interrupt? Do you have a red beanie? Do you wear like a little red beanie? Like a little red cap? Like Jacques Cousteau?
No, I don't.
You know what I'm saying? Okay. All right. That's my favorite part of the uniform.
Oh, okay. No. But yeah, that very, very French, I suppose. I have one actually. Somebody gave it to me, but really unrelated. I actually don't wear it. But yeah, and so I was also really, really interested in arts and design. But that, I suppose, always stayed with me. And I've always had, this urge to tackle issues of justice. So in my undergrads in architecture, I actually worked in a project developing like a community-oriented project in a very poor and disadvantaged community in San Jose. And so I suppose that's when it all started, bringing the environmental and social justice lens into it. And then I went on, I was very lucky. I was able to get a scholarship and do a Master's of Environment at the University of Melbourne. I was starting to kind of steer away from the more kind of architectural construction side of local scale things and trying to have a bigger picture, landscape scale picture of things. And then I was able to do a PhD, and it was really around nature-based solutions, or just this idea of nature in cities. I came in from the lens of there's this idea which is gaining a lot of momentum. Is how can we enhance, how can we create more nature in cities through this idea of nature-based solutions. It was kind of taking a critical perspective and seeing how we could incorporate a justice lens when designing and planning nature-based solutions.
And so you talked about this group, the NovelEco comrades. How do you all operate? What are your major sort of interests in studying or exploring?
The project wants to explore and understand not only the ecology of novel ecosystems, or how we are calling them wild spaces or informal wild spaces, but we also want to understand how people feel about them. And more importantly, if once people start engaging with them and knowing more about them, if perceptions change over time. We are a small team. The project NovelEco is an ERC-funded project that's running for 5 years. So it started in 2020. Professor Marcus Collier, who is the principal investigator. We have a project manager. We also have a master's student. And there's 2 postdocs, myself and a colleague. And there's a third postdoc that's going to come in and work on aspects more related to machine learning and citizen science engagement. So it has a very important co-design element to it. So we want to know from different communities around the world what they would like to know and how they feel about the spaces. So all this information that we are trying to gather, that we have been gathering, is going to inform this online instrument or tool that we are going to be developing in the next months, which is the instrument that's going to help us capture all this data around ecology and perceptions.
I will tell you, I'm going to confess something. I would say a couple years ago, I would say I was one of the people resisting the concept for so long. And because of the way I was trained, I'm trying to restore Pacific Northwest, like old growth ecosystems and whatnot. I would say I was a kind of a resistor, but over the past few years, I've sort of come around to acknowledge, and there was like some little sticking points I had issues with, but overall, I kind of tuning my ears and listening to people, and just acknowledging in a different way, or recognizing in a different way, the sort of nature, the nearby nature that surrounds me, especially in urban areas. So I just want to tell you that. So I was very skeptical. And even now, I don't know if I think I'm fully like, we never know everything, I guess, and I'm still learning. And so the reason why I reached out to you is because you came through across my radar. You were the principal author on this paper titled Finding Justice in Wild Novel Ecosystems, a review through a multi-species lens. And I really appreciate the tether you created between justice and these ecosystems that are kind of these self-willed, unintentional landscapes, or they're defined in different ways. Because I think tangentially on the podcast, I've mentioned novel ecosystems, but we haven't dug deep into them yet. I was wondering if you could define novel ecosystems or characterize ways people have described them.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I suppose the more traditional definition of novel ecosystems, refers to kind of this idea that there are these spaces which have had this intense or extreme human modification. So its land use has been changed in some occasions many times to a point where it's crossed a threshold. And then at some point in time, they've been kind of abandoned or neglected or let go. And nature, a new form of nature, has appropriated this space. And the novelty of it, that the new nature, is what also I think makes people very uncomfortable. It's novel and it's new because it's a composition or species assemblages that has not been seen before. What is it that was there before? Was it 100 years? Was it 200 years? Was it 1,000 years? Or do we have to go all the way back to 40,000 years? So what is this historical baseline that we would be comparing it to? But really, these novel ecosystems have this characteristic that pretty much self-organizing, self-regulated, self-assembled, self-willed. Yeah, they formed on their own accord.
That's
Yeah.
great. In your paper, I feel like it's one of the better literature reviews that I've seen because you actually tease out all these different ways, not just from one aspect of one little niche discipline, but like it's more transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary. So I feel like there's all these ways that people, like as a restoration ecologist, I'm describing them a certain way, but there's actually geographers and sociologists and different folks like actually like talking about these things, being skeptical or just asking questions and exploring it. So I appreciated that. And
Yes,
there's like they're
I'm
being
glad.
described in these elegant ways, I think, too, which are so interesting. That gives the nature agency. You say that self-willed landscape. Do you have a favorite novel ecosystem? Does it exist in your mind, or is there an actual place you can describe for us, or do you have a story about one?
Yeah, this is actually a tough question. I think it's in my mind. Yes,
Okay,
it's in
that's
my
fine.
mind. And I think my favorite ecosystem, I have experienced them, and I think many people that also finds connections with novel ecosystems probably has experienced this too. And I think this is one of the things that draws people to these sites. Um, and I've encountered many of these, but it's these types, let's say, of novel ecosystems that you find especially in cities, which are kind of like enclosed by walls and maybe like gates, and people have put stuff, the ownership is blurry, so people kind of try to block them. There's like legal frameworks and ownership things behind them, so they're kind of hidden away. But then suddenly somebody opens a door or somebody breaks in, or you're able to have a peek, and it's just kind of like, yeah, this wild ecosystem, in the middle of this really dense built area. And it's kind of like it has that kind of element of surprise, and almost like it's almost like just like magical, like all of these things for decades were happening around, and quietly and silently, this fantastic fourth new nature was kind of growing over there. So yeah, those I would say are my favorite. But I also have another favorite, which are the micro ones, those really small ones, those ones that grow in corners, in cracks, those little tiny ones that that are also fantastic in their own way, because it's really harsh environments, always changing, people stepping all over them, people trying to kill them with pesticides, but still somehow they manage to get through cracks and grow. And yeah.
Hmm. That's right. Yeah. I don't know if anyone else heard it. I heard you say the term fourth nature. Is that right?
Fourth
And
nature, yes.
yeah, and based on your recommendation, I actually started reading Matthew Gandy's book. I don't know where this comes from in the Wayback Machine. Somebody described these like first, second, third, fourth natures, right?
Yeah, and I think that's also a good researcher in Germany called Ingo Kowarik. I think that the framework that he proposes to describe it is also very useful, especially in cities, talking about like this first nature is kind of like these remnant patches of the more original, in quotation marks, ecosystems, all the way to the more design ones, the more hybrid ones, and then these ones, which are the kind of the other extreme, which is, the self-willed, self-autonomous new nature, which he calls that fourth nature.
I have a couple spots in my mind as well. Do you want to hear about
Mhm.
them?
Yes, of
I have a
course.
couple spots in Seattle. There's a couple examples. I have so many, honestly, because I think I'm either looking for them now or I'm just like my perspective has switched. So there's one spot, it's not really a restoration in which I'm normally involved with, but there's a few lakes around Seattle. There's this one kind of in the middle of town. It's called Lake Union. Historically, it was Duwamish land and the lake people, but at some point during colonization, there's a lot of industry was created around the lake, and so there's these remnant like kind of artifacts right around. And so on this one northern section, it's called Gasworks Park, there was this factory there. It was preserved as a park, super contaminated, right? So probably considered like a brown field. It was capped, and so it's probably relatively safe, I guess, to like have a park on top of it. But it still has these like cracking towers that
Mhm.
are like this really gritty industrial image of Seattle, and it was fenced off several years ago because they're dangerous and people like to climb them and explore them, right? But they've been fenced off, and so that means like since they're fenced off largely, not many people can go inside, but not many people like slip through the fence. But there's these vines that have grown up the towers. So often like the weeds that we often think don't belong are there. So like blackberries and ivy. And I thought it's sort of creepy, but like I felt like novel because I was in there. Not a lot of people get to enter. But then in the middle of these towers was my favorite tree was growing out of the middle of these towers, probably like 15, 20 feet tall. I'd probably been there for like a decade or more. And it really hit me very emotionally. And they actually they wanted us to cut it down because they don't want to have allow people to climb up these things. But I resisted. I was like, no, you're okay. You gotta find somebody else, some other lackey to like remove this tree because it's so cool. So at some point, maybe we'll lose the tree. Yeah.
What's the tree, if I can ask?
So it's the Pacific Madrone. We talk about it a lot on this podcast. A broadleaf evergreen. It has like really funky bark and everything. It's gorgeous. I'll send you a picture of it. So that's my one story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's part of the inspiration for this paper. It's about kind of highlighting, where and on what do we place value. And then we take action, and we take an action of care. If we don't value and we associate these spaces, as derelict and as, places that attract unwanted behavior and also unwanted people, that is an injustice in itself. We're reflecting our own values and not recognizing there's other kinds of value there and other kind of entanglements happening. It has to be, I suppose, recognized and addressed in some way, not just dealt with and displaced, which is what tends to happen to many of these kind of interstitial, in-between spaces, unwanted spaces, which have all these entangled life happening. They have these so-called, in quotes, invasive species, but then you have also campers, people probably without a home, people, that are using these spaces probably because that's the last space that they can use because everything else is privatized. So yeah, I think they're fascinating spaces and places. And one of the things that I'm trying to understand is how could potentially these spaces inform other ways of ownership, planning, management, care for nature, care for people as well.
Yeah, and I think reaching out to you too, I was looking for some sort of guidance because sometimes I don't think we know what to do, right? The inclination is to resist their existence, right? Often in restoration ecology or ecological restoration anyway, sometimes it's implicit, sometimes it's explicit. We want to turn back the clock for this historical fidelity to like pre-colonization based on this conception of a new world we've discovered, an indigenous erasure and whatnot. So, and we want to remove all the unwanted things. And so, I guess, how do you think we navigate care and reconciliation of this new nature?
Yeah, I think, as you might already see, I think we have to come with a lens that's more of compassion and justice and respect. And that has to do with recognizing that there are many life forms. And I really like these ideas, around autonomy and agency of the non-human, because you can see it. There is intention in nature, in non-human nature. There is intention there. There is an intentionality. It's not that we have to let things go. It's that we recognize that there is resilience in nature, and that especially like in these smaller patches or patches that require this intense sort of management, to be constant restoration, to be able to keep the unwanted out. It's almost like having like some sort of mid-intervention, an intervention of care that allows for a little bit of less control, but also recognizing that I am trying to kill and displace these other species. I'm trying to understand the value in these species, like the power they have right now to be able to survive in these such harsh environments, in a changing climate, experiencing extreme events. urban environments anyway tend to be quite harsh, contaminated, polluted, constantly changing land uses. So what can we learn from them? They are, in a sense, living laboratories for us to explore and learn from them. I don't know if you've heard about Emma Maris. And
Yes, yeah, I read her book. Again, I read her book during my skeptical years a couple of years ago.
so you were like, no.
And then she showed up at a conference, at a symposium a couple years ago, and I heard her
Okay.
speak right after Eric Higgs, and they left some takeaway messages with me. I'm very fond of Emma Maris. Actually, I thought about reaching out to her. I believe she lives in Paris right now. So, Emma, I don't know if Emma's listening.
Could have her in the podcast. She's been helping us with NovelEco, and for me, it has been really. It's been maybe read the book again, Michael, because well, for me, it's been really helpful to kind of see and better understand novel ecosystems, because she takes a global perspective because she kind of visits all these places around the world, but she also kind of goes into the local and dwells kind of in the experiences of different people doing conservation in different parts of the world. But I think she's like, in a sense, also a bit of a philosopher. She poses really important questions as well. Like, for example, we're trying to do conservation based on certain values passed on to us even from childhood, but also, from, in your case, studying restoration ecology and then practicing it. Where is the compassion when we're also kind of killing and displacing species that have already established there? What is the ethics behind that as well? Then, while we're doing it, we're giving opportunity for other species to come. What do we have to do after that once we kill and displace these species that have been established, which are not the species that we want, but it's the other species that we want? What type of management do we have to put in place to be able to then support these species that we want to be there for, 10 years, 20 years? I think these are all like really important questions, and she
Mhm.
has, I think it's this book, Rambunctious Garden. She has this interesting framework because she says like she's in favor of conservation ecology, restoration ecology. She proposes kind of like almost like a suite of different types of interventions. So from the more traditional conservation, restoration ecology, to like the more innovative ones, which have to do even like with genetic modification of animals so they're able to survive, to the ones which is kind of just recognizing the novel wild ecosystems. Part of her critique is about this notion of wilderness, which I think is quite based in the global north, I would say, because a few of the interviews that I've done through this project, trying to bring some voices from the global south, it has been really difficult to translate the word wild or wilderness. But so what Emma says is, even like in this kind of in between abandoned species, this is the wilderness of the Anthropocene. This is actually self-willed, self-created, self-organized. I find that really inspirational, and I think something that really we can look into to be able to plan and better design and care for nature.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely there's some practicality to, yeah, just leaving some spaces, not tinkering so much, and just seeing how things assemble on their own and adapt. Because if we remove everything in all the places, I guess they'll be gone, right? So we won't have that lab to observe. I like how what you said about having this portfolio approach to, like, some places you can try to control, like, and see how it goes, and then other places you can sort of guide that trajectory to that novel assemblage of species, and other places you just accept, right? And the abundance that is there.
I think so,
Um,
yeah. Mm.
yeah, it's interesting too. You use this word like abandoned, and I will say I am kind of a fan of like zombie apocalypse movies. I don't know if you are. Are you? Okay.
I
I
am.
just finished The Last of Us. I think I was kind of behind the curve on like watching it, but yeah, I just dug into it, and they evoke it there. It's kind of in the background. The story is obviously around the people, but in the background, I sort of imagine this post-human places. It's like post-human, but also like the whole ecosystem is prefaced by this sort of damage or degradation or destruction that's happening. And so also being a podcast fan, I probably wouldn't exist if Ologies wasn't a podcast. And Ali Ward did this recent podcast on domecology, and I sent some of this information to you. And there's been a lot of times like Detroit and just that's been held up as the example of a place that was like so robust and bustling and such a major population center. And since then has gone through a radical change. It's probably the poster child for abandoned places. And so recently, too, there's this whole book that was released a couple years ago, Cal Flynn's book called The Islands of Abandonment. And some of the examples of like Chernobyl, places where there's like nuclear fallout and some things can't live, but then over time and space, species start to come back. And so there are all these examples like shipwrecks and like all these kind of different places that exist on the margins. Brownfields are also often the object of restoration a lot of the time. So it's just a matter of time before a lot of these places are sort of reclaimed for, as people, we create value somehow by like eradicating the things we don't like and reconfiguring them in other ways.
Yeah. And look, from the perspective of NovelEco, the project we're working on, that's part of what we're trying to also understand, how you could categorize them into kind of these three systems: the infrastructure system, the ecological system, and the social system. In these places, kind of this infrastructure system is in ruins or abandoned built structures that have now kind of really sort of entangled with this new nature. It's not that there's never a human relationship or human intervention. There is people always interested in these kind of spaces. And just as some people are repulsed by seeing these ruins, there's also some people are always fascinated by these reclaimed ruined spaces. And I think part of that fascination stems from this notion, that the resilience of nature, of reclaiming back. Even in a year's time, you can already see things going through the cracks. I do find that quite fascinating and incredible. I'm not an ecologist, but, I also find fascinating what kind of seeing the succession of that, into what does it become? What's the potential of that system in becoming, entangled also with this contamination and pollution, and maybe with poor soils, and perhaps you have experience with this. I should ask you, but what happens in 10, 20, 30 years, in many cases, you end up with quite integral and healthy woodland, for example, or, a quite robust ecosystem providing many functionings and supporting lots of biodiversity. So I find that quite incredible.
Yes, there was this paper recently co-authored by Dov Sachs, just talking about the potential benefits and services of non-native species, essentially, and just kind of enlightening us to the fact that a lot of the literature, anyway, that I would consume, like in my journals of my industry, they don't acknowledge the value of non-native species, right? We are either indifferent to them or they bring a negative connotation. So we often don't think about the short-term relational values or the textbook ecosystem services that they're providing. There's a liana English ivy, which grows like really abundantly. It's totally ubiquitous around the Puget Sound area where I live. We don't have that structure in the forest. There's not another liana or vine that climbs. And English ivy's been well studied that it cleans the air, right? Or it catches particulates off the freeway and everything. So I do think there's sometimes some value in just leaving it alone because it's doing the job, right? It's actually healing some damage from previous years. It's
Yeah,
not the actual threat itself. It's actually kind of the symptom of previous destruction.
absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, I really like that word. Not everybody likes it, but I really like that word of mutual healing, because it also comes from the idea of respect and compassion and justice. It's about how can we mutually heal and repair each other without, I suppose, displacing or finding the bad guys and then just killing them, to allow for the ones that we want to be there. From a global perspective, it's just such an interconnected world. It almost seems like an impossible task to be able to control the spread of unwanted species. I think Emma Maris and a few others studying or doing conservation biology, and it's really almost possible to do it in islands where there is like more control. But even then, it's difficult. You still have people going in and out, going in and out. So things are spreading, and this is just nothing. It's in a steady state. It's always continuously evolving and changing, and and modifying. So I think, yeah, it's good to sometimes challenge our assumptions and just also because, if you think of it from a more practical perspective and how much money at the end does conservation and restoration get, you would want to put the most amount of money and resources and efforts into what, is really going to work.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Let's think about it from the financial point of view, because I've made that statement, like bigger fish to fry.
We have bigger fish to fry or some
Bigger
better
fish.
things to worry about.
Yeah, better things to worry about, like climate disruption and like actually responding to climate. So I don't know. This is your chance to like tell us what else can we be spending our money on.
I definitely think more money should be spent on finding ways to protect and conserve nature and all types of nature. And more ways should be found to challenge our more extractive and consumptive ways, which is also what drives these changes in our environment and creates more and exacerbates already injustices in place. For example, like from an urban perspective, because this is kind of like the context that I work in and something that I've been really interested in lately. Cities are already quite dense. There is a lot of contestation around spaces, a lot of interests for developing certain areas. I find that in these type of spaces like novel ecosystems, if you look at a map, like a zoning map, a planning map, you will see that these spaces would be gray or blanked out. That's how we are representing them. What happens if we are then recognizing them and acknowledging them in a different way? Then we wouldn't be representing them blank or gray in a map. They would have other values. They would have biodiversity values. They would have ecological values. Then that changes the way that we intervene in them. And then instead of changing what's already there and displacing what's already there, we could find other approaches and other ways to develop that space, that benefits people and local communities and nature rather than certain interests. What happens if we put these efforts and more of this funding into actually creating spaces that are more useful for the community, more useful for biodiversity?
Is there a novel place you'd like to visit or explore or study on the horizon, or like a dream project?
Thank you so much for asking that question, Michael, because maybe the universe will listen to me. Look, since I did my PhD, I've always wanted to do a case study in Costa Rica or Central America or Latin America. And I've always had this intense desire to include places in the global south, because this research also tends to focus a lot in the global north or, North America or Europe or Australia. And we tend to do kind of work in the same cities. So the project we're working on, I was able to include a few voices, but not really to the degree that I wanted. So I really hope that in the future, I can just kind of study urban wild spaces in, for example, the Latin American context, but more specifically in Costa Rica. I think that would be fantastic. And I would really like to work around a few of the urban rivers that we have there, which are highly polluted and degraded. Back home, we tend to give the back to our rivers. So, trying to explore all of these dynamics would be just fantastic.
Cool. I think it's very valuable because you think of like where most people live these days, right? Worldwide, it's mostly urban, right? So it's very valuable. Yeah, very valuable work from my viewpoint anyway. So where can people track your work and find out more about you?
Find me at Twitter, just Mel Pineda-Pinto, or you can just search for my name, Melissa Pineda-Pinto, which is, I think, maybe might be a particular name you might be able to find. You can find me in Google Scholar. You can also find me in the website of our project, NovelEco. If not as well, just shoot me an email, which would be also in, any of these social media sites. And yeah, happy to respond and have a chat with anybody that's interested. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
All righty. Well, I appreciate the discussion. Thanks so much for accepting my invitation. It's great to meet
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me again for another episode of Tree Hugger Podcast. I'm Michael Yadrick. Please check the show description for information about Mel Pineda-Pinto, where you can find out more about them at Twitter at NovelEco. I would love to hear what you think about this topic. Let me know. The archive of this episode lives online at treehuggerpod.com. Tree Hugger Podcast is on social media at treehuggerpod, so feel free to ping me there. or treehuggerpod@gmail.com. It takes a community to keep the podcast going. I'm totally independent, and you can donate to help cover the small overhead costs for the show at myadrick via PayPal and Venmo, and on Cash App, Michael Yadrick Jr. Subscribe, rate, and review the show, please, on whichever podcast platform you enjoy listening to. It helps people find the show. And tell your friends about the show. Thanks for hanging out. See you in the interstitial spaces.
So that's my one story. And then I have another one. I don't know if you want to hear it, but another one that's on the edge, like you said, these like little cracks where like no one really owns the property. It's just been parcelized like everywhere. Formerly probably wetland that was filled, was a landfill. And at some point they capped the landfill and then built a golf course on top of it. And so we're just really working around the edges. And so it's really just this kind of steep slope that may or may not have methane leaking out of the hill. And there's a wetland. That was probably one of the few remaining wetlands in this neighborhood, and mostly just blackberry and poison hemlock.
Mm-mm.
There's people living on the site, campers, and it exists in this like unimproved right-of-way, street right-of-way that dead ends at like a railroad tracks. And then there's like a parking lot on one side. So it is like this crack in the city where like no one really claims, no one takes responsibility for it. And the values reflected there are like, we sort of like roll our eyes when we look at it because it's not like a tidy ecosystem like we think.
Thanks for hanging out. See you in the unintentional landscapes. Thanks for hanging out. See you in the non-analog communities. Thanks for hanging out. See you in the urban wildscape.